I am really grateful for being invited to this conference by organizers. It is an honor, even though I suspect in my case it's not completely deserved. The topic of my discussion with you is liberal democracy, natural rights, and legal positivism. Those are the issues which we have already discussed in the morning session. So I will repeat many of those observations by other speakers today, but perhaps from a slightly different perspective. So the regime we live in and under is called liberal or constitutional democracy. It has been established firstly in English-speaking nations, and as a founding manifest of liberal democratic creed, we might quote, as Professor Troiani has already quoted, the American Declaration of Independence. I will focus on that part of the declaration, which is called the credo, the confession of faith, so to speak, of liberal democracy. There are 6 basic fundamental propositions. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Firstly, there are truth, political and moral truth, with capital T, which means absolute truth. Secondly, the founders claimed they were self-evident. Thirdly, that all men are created equal, ontological equality of human beings, and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Inalienable, which means natural, not as a gifts from government, but given by human nature. Among those rights were mentioned rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Fifthly, governments are established among the people in order to secure those rights. If we could demonstrate by reason that we have certain fundamental rights, then of course, some of duties, not perhaps all, but at least some of duties of governments would be to secure those rights. And sixthly, governments derive their just powers, not any powers, but just powers, by and with the consent of the governed. That's the democratic part of the liberal democratic regime. I would like to mention that when Jewish, German, and later American political philosopher Leo Strauss, or Leo Strauss, as Americans called him, wrote or published his book called The Natural Right and History in 1953. In the introduction to that book, he quoted that part of the Declaration of the US independence and sadly observed that in America of the mid-century, of the mid of the last century, the doctrine of natural rights was mostly abandoned, at least for the half of a century, by leading American public philosophers and historians. Leo Strauss claimed that the doctrine of natural rights was pushed from public awareness among intellectuals, not the people, by what he called the German historical school, or historicism, which claimed that there are no natural rights, rights by nature, but all rights, so to speak, are just conventions imposed by an evolutionary historical process. Historicism, in that sense, is a kind of relativism, because if true, it would claim that what was right yesterday is not necessarily right today, and maybe even a crime tomorrow. Since those times, since the last 60 years, 65 years, the situation has a little bit changed in America. There are some schools of natural rights. One of them is the so-called Claremont School in Southern California by some students and disciples of Leo Strauss. Other schools of natural rights are among some radical libertarians. I myself am not completely opposed to the doctrine of natural rights in the classical liberal sense, meaning individual liberties, not collective privileges. However, I think it's incomplete. The idea of natural individual rights, in my view, and in view of many others, must be complemented with the idea of the rights of family. rights of family. There is one excuse for the founders, for those classical liberals of Enlightenment. They considered family to be so self-evident that they did not see any reason why to proclaim special rights of families. Now, of course, we are living in another age, and what was obvious for them is not obvious for many people, or maybe even most people living in the West today. Now, look at the countries and the regimes which emerged in my part of Europe, meaning Central Eastern Europe, 30 years ago, after the collapse of communism. All those countries have adopted their own national charters of fundamental rights and liberties modeled on the United Nations Charter of 1948. So just before coming here, I looked at the Czech constitution. The part of the Czech constitution is the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Liberties, that's the name in Czech. And the Article 1 proclaims, fundamental rights are inalienable, irrevocable, unviolable, they cannot be surrendered, and they cannot be abolished. So it's obviously an idea of natural rights. So even now, our constitutional regimes, our constitutional theory of our liberal constitutional democracies presupposes the existence of natural rights as preceding just government powers. Well, if we think deeply about the idea of natural rights, as many speakers this morning have mentioned, the very idea of natural rights presupposes a constant, unalterable, fixed human nature. And that the human nature of human beings as a rational persons with free will, which is the fact is the basic for human dignity and all other following rights, means that human nature and, in consequence, natural rights are to be not created by human will or human license, but discovered by human reason, right reason, and well-informed conscience. So as we cannot, by will, create human nature, we cannot create, by legislative process, fundamental rights. We can only acknowledge them and respect them and try to secure them by the just powers of government. After the fall of communism, it was very easy for us to accept by both the public and by leading legal and philosophic scholars the idea of natural rights. Why was this easy? Because of the 50 years of totalitarianism. First Nazism, then communism. The crimes of those regimes were so obvious, or to use the language of the Declaration of Independence, so self-evident, that people easily acknowledge that something, even if legally proclaimed, is not necessarily morally binding. It could be void and null if it is contrary to human nature and the innate dignity of human persons. So the adoption of the doctrine of natural rights in our countries was, and I would say that was the case of the United Nations Charter in 1948, that those were the reactions against totalitarianisms, Nazism and communism. So the legal positivism, as Gustav Radbruch mentioned before the lunch here, recognized the problem with legal positivism was that if the will or license of legislator who has effective power or force in any given country, regardless whether the legislator is one or few or many, if it is the supreme law of the land, then many crimes could be proclaimed as legal under the false label of legality. So the idea of the deep flaws of legal positivism was quite obvious to people after 50 years of totalitarianism. Very well and good. Now, the problems. Firstly, theoretical problems. Secondly, practical problems. Theoretical problems. The most recent offspring in the history of Western or European philosophy, called postmodernism or postmodernist philosophy, emphatically denies that any truth with capital T exists at all. Postmodernism as a philosophical movement prevalent among Western intellectuals claims that there are no absolute objective truth discovered by human reason. There are only individual opinions. And there is a radical plurality of individual opinions, and that's why we must not and cannot judge which individual opinion is more right or more true or more just than any other. So we are in an epistemological impasse. After, let us say, 2,500 years of Western philosophy, the conclusion of the most recent offspring of the philosophy is that we really know nothing really important for our moral lives and for our social political lives as political communities. So that's a paradox that our even now cherished constitutional theory deeply depends, fundamentally depends, on the idea of known, by human reason, known moral and political truth with capital T, and our most recent philosophy, the very possibility denies. So there is a discrepancy between our constitutional theory and what is presented to us as the most recent, most respectable philosophical school. Secondly, practical problems. The most obvious practical problem with our constitutional systems and regimes being based on natural rights is, of course, the case of abortion. Everybody in theory agrees that the right to life is the most fundamental. Because if we are killed, we cannot enjoy or other nice rights and liberties like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom to own legitimately acquired property, and so on and so on. However, abortion denies the fact that we have a natural, fundamental right to life. And it is based on too early an age. We have natural right to life only those of us who have survived 9 months of pregnancy. If we haven't survived by abortion, there is, politically speaking, no problem. So Western political regimes are schizophrenic. I must mention, which is not necessary to mention, that pure human reason without any faith and any religion could discover that abortion is against natural rights. I myself, when I was 19, 20 years old, I was not a Catholic, I was not a Christian, I was an agnostic. And just by my internal reasoning, I have found out that, well, abortion is illegitimate. I thought, well, Catholics were those strange people with strange beliefs. But on that one issue, they were right, to my amazement. And then I had second thought that perhaps if Catholic Church was right on that issue, maybe she was right on some other issues as well. And then I converted when I was 30 years old. There are other problems concerning the idea of natural rights or natural law in Western societies. If we reject the concept that we can create human nature and consequently rights by our pure will, then we may judge many ideologies as incompatible with human dignity and a free society. Of course, those ideologies which deny the right to life of significant strata and segments of population on the basis of their ethnic origin or racial origin or class origin or some other arbitrary criteria. Even those ideologies which are not murderous, which do not directly demand slaughter of innocents like Nazism, communism did in the past, or Islamism, I mean not the religion of Islam, but Islamism as a political ideology, demands today. We can judge even some others who are arbitrary in their division of human race, human mankind into artificial divisions. For example, racism. So-called scientific racists claimed that the differences among members of different races were so important that they minimized a common human nature of all people. So they did not imply directly, but indicated that perhaps there is not one common human nature, but there are different, at least 3 different racial natures of different races. So racism in itself is an ideology incompatible with the idea of one common human nature and natural rights. Another one, and I would compare it to racism in that sense, is the transgender movement. If we look at the 4 letters LGBT, I at least, and that's not me only, there are many people who have recognized that there is an internal contradiction between the first 3 letters and the last 4th letter. LGB people recognize the reality of 2 sexes, 2 biological sexes, male and female. And they are attracted to either same sex or to both sexes in the case of bisexuals, but at least the name bisexuals indicates there are 2 sexes. So it's a recognition of human nature, that human beings exist in 2 modes of being, male and female. And then some sexual desires could be disordered to the same sex, not to the opposite sex. But still, the LGB presupposes 2 sexes. But what about the letter T? Transgender. I myself don't use the word gender. I consider it to be an ideological construct, not a reality. So I prefer the old name sex, biological sex, meaning either male or female, as something which represents reality, which is not a construct, but a natural reality. But the transgender ideology suggests that we can choose and or create our own biological sex. We can change it by will, if we decide, or if we feel in that way. So we, by our will, or I would say license, could deny reality as it is and try to create and impose on others reality as a product of our will, choice, or license. So it's another denial of human nature. And there is an internal paradox in the transgender movement, because if it denies human nature as a fixed, as a given, to be recognized by reason, by right reason, then it denies any reasons for their own natural rights. So it's a subversive doctrine towards natural rights of both transgender people and all other human beings as well. Now, because we are at the Pontifical University, and the issue is natural law, natural rights, or natural right, Leo Strauss distinguished between those 3 terms, natural right, natural rights, in the Lockean version, and natural law in the, let us say, Aristotelian Thomistic version. There is an issue of capital punishment. All natural law, natural rights theories considered the death penalty not to be an intrinsic evil, not to be evil per se or in itself. Unlike abortion, which is an intentional killing of innocents, capital punishment has been always perceived as a just punishment for those guilty of horrible crimes. Now, we can reject capital punishment on prudential reasons, as too cruel for our society, not necessary, not even desirable. Those all are prudential judgments, and I think that political societies themselves should be prudent enough to choose whether capital punishment would be prudent, necessary, or otherwise unnecessary, unwarranted, and too barbaric for them. For example, I do not desire capital punishment for my political society, meaning both the Czech Republic and the European Union. I don't see any reason why it should be reintroduced. However, I simply do not know whether it is possible to break up drug narco cartels in Mexico without capital punishment. And I would not be willing to impose my will on the Mexican political society. Or the case of Nigeria. I simply do not know whether it is possible to destroy that death cult called Boko Haram, which kills, murders, kidnaps, and rapes without capital punishment. But I would always acknowledge that the Nigerian political society should have the prudential right to decide for itself. But let us return to my original point of view. The liberal democratic regime is based philosophically on the idea of natural rights. However, the very idea of natural rights is being subverted by the political praxis, most prominently by abortion, and by some other movements like transgender, and by postmodernist political theory. So my conclusion is, liberal democracy as a regime is in a deep trouble. Thank you for your attention.